Welcome back. This is Principles of Macroeconomics. I'm Liam Malloy, and this is the first video for Chapter 3. And in Chapter 3, we're going to talk about gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is one of the three big variables, along with unemployment and inflation, that we talk about in macroeconomics. And gross domestic product, or GDP, is the value of everything we produce in the economy. And that is going to be hugely important because not only is it, everything that we make, all the goods and services that we produce and are able to consume, but it's also equal to the income that we have. And so when we think about GDP per capita, or the amount of gross domestic product per person, that is a measure of the average level of income per person available in the economy. So let's get started. So when we think about GDP, we're going to think about it in a number of ways. We're going to think about it from the perspective of how much we produce, so the production side or supply side. We're going to think about who buys all that stuff, so we think about that from the demand side. And as we said, it's also equal to all the income, right? So that goes back to our number one thing that we want to remember in macroeconomics, is that one person's spending is another person's income. And so we're really going to take advantage of that idea in what we call the multiplier model. And so we'll build that later in the chapter. All right, so first we'll start off with a quick introduction and then measuring the total economy, total GDP. We'll think about what that GDP is. We want to think about the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP, just like we had the difference between nominal wages and real wages in chapters 1 and 2. Then we will build our multiplier model, which is really just the whole concept of one person's spending is another person's income. And then we'll talk about the two sort of most important pieces of GDP, consumption and investment, and how they behave differently, especially over the business cycle. And so the business cycle are the ups and downs of the aggregate economy, and so we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so when we think about GDP, often what we're thinking about is, is it growing? Is it shrinking? What's going on? And related to that is what's going on in the labor market. And so we started with the labor market in chapters 1 and 2 because we have, we want to focus on things like the unemployment rate and wages. But GDP is very much related, right? The more people are working, the more GDP is going to grow. And when we have a recession, like the 2008 recession here, then GDP is going to shrink. And that's one of sort of the mysteries of macroeconomics, right? When GDP shrinks, because in 2009, we had the same number of people as we had in 2007. We had the same capital, we had the same technology, and yet we produced about 4% less in 2009 than in 2007. And that meant that a lot of people were unemployed, income had gone down. And so one of the questions that we want to think about in this class is, well, how can we prevent that, right? How can we prevent those recessions? Or if we can't prevent recessions from coming, how can we make them not as bad, right? What policies can we use to try to smooth out the ups and downs of the business cycle? So in this chapter, we will introduce this idea of national accounts. We really didn't have a good measure of GDP until the 1930s, right? So we'll talk about the 1930s at the end of the semester in the last chapter that we talk about. But it's called the Great Depression. And the Great Depression was a situation in which GDP fell significantly. The unemployment rate hit about 25% in the United States. And one of the things that we realized was that we didn't really have a great measure of what was going on in the economy. And so it was at that time that an economist named Simon Kuznets developed the national accounts along with many other people. And so we'll think about that focusing on GDP. And then we'll think about, why GDP, goes up and down over the business cycle. So it tends to go up in what we call expansions. And that's when, things are going well. The unemployment rate is generally falling or steady. And then we get to a recession. something happens, and we'll talk about what those somethings are, and GDP goes down and the unemployment rate goes up. And so our main model in this chapter will be the multiplier model, in which we can see that, when spending increases, that increases people's income. Higher income increases spending, and we get a sort of virtuous cycle of increasing GDP. But then the opposite can happen as well during a recession, in which spending falls, income falls, and we end up with lower GDP. So we're going to think about sort of 3 ways to think about measuring the aggregate economy, right? So we usually talk about GDP, gross domestic product, in this sort of output frame. But then that has to be equal to, what we buy. So everything we buy has to be equal to what we produce. And because one person's spending is another person's income, that is also equal to gross domestic income. And so we have these 3 ways of measuring the aggregate economy, and we'll talk about those each individually. All right, so here on the right-hand side is just a very simplified model of our circular flow diagram. And the circular flow diagram, remember, just shows that firms produce goods and services that are bought by households, but they also buy factors of production, which just means the things that they use to make those goods and services, especially labor, but also capital from those households. And so the money, right, goes from households to firms to buy the goods and services, but also from firms to households to pay for the labor and capital. And so that's our expenditure side for GDP, is households buying stuff. Now, of course, also firms buy things from other firms as well, and we'll talk about that. And in our more complicated circular flow diagram, we had the government, who also buys things and provides goods and services. And then we could also add, people outside the economy. So exports get sold to other countries, and we buy imports from other countries. We'll talk about that later in the semester. We'll talk about a little bit this chapter. Then we can also think about the value added by firms. And so the value added, which we'll talk about in the next slide, is really the difference between what you sell your goods and services for minus what you paid for the raw material that you used, right? So if we're thinking about, someone making sweaters, the revenue is how much they sell the sweaters for, and then the value added is that revenue minus their, what we call cost of goods sold, right? So their wool or cotton and any other materials that they have to use to make the sweaters. Now, when we think about that value added, we think about, okay, well, who is adding the value, right? Well, the value is being added by the workers, and so that's part of income, but it's also being added by the firm, right? The firm is getting the workers and the capital together and creating some value, and so that's the profit that the firm earns. And so the value added has to be equal to the total income in the economy. All right, so here's an example for the value added approach. And so we have 3 industries. We have a raw cotton industry, we have a cloth industry, and we have a shirt industry. So let's start with the cotton industry. We're just going to assume they have no cost of inputs, just for simplification, right? They probably have to, buy some seeds or whatever and fertilizer. The price of their output is $50, and so 50 minus 0 is $50. Now they sell their cotton to the cloth industry. The cloth industry takes that cotton and spins it and weaves it and turns it into cloth. And so then they sell that cloth for $80. But their value added is not 80, right? It is 80 minus the $50 that they paid for the cotton, and so that's $30. Then we have the final industry, the shirt industry. And the shirt industry takes that cloth, they cut it up and sew it together and make shirts, and they sell those shirts for $100. And so that's their revenue, but they had to pay $80 for the cloth, and so their value added is 100 minus 80, or $20. Now, with GDP, we can really sort of measure it in two different ways, even just from a table like this. So one is just to look at the final expenditure on shirts, $100. And that $100 includes the value from the cotton industry, from the cloth industry, and from the shirt industry. So we don't want to add up the 50 and the 80 and the 100 because then we're double counting, right? The 80 double counts the 50 and the 100 double counts both, the 80 and the 50. And so we only count final expenditure goods and services. And so for GDP, we could just look at all of the final sales of all the goods and services, add them up, and that would give us our GDP. Or we can look at the value added for each firm. And so here it would be $50 for the cotton industry, $30 for the cloth industry, and $20 for the shirt industry. 50 plus 30 plus 20 is also 100, right? And theoretically, that will always be the same. Of course, when you're adding up a $30 trillion economy, you're going to get slightly different numbers when you add up different ways to do it, but they're pretty close, right? And the other approach that we talked about is adding up all the income, right? So adding up all the income for, the farm workers and the farm owners, the people working in the cloth industry and the profits of the cloth industry, and then all the people working in the shirt industry and the profits of the shirt industry, and adding up all that, and that would be $100 as well. Again, we call that gross domestic income, or GDI, and when we add it up for a $30 trillion economy, we get close to GDP when we measure GDP, but there's some differences just because of measurement error. So we can also now think of GDP as all the things that we buy, right? All of those final sales. And it's useful to divide it up into who is doing the buying. And so we can think about households that are buying consumer goods and services. So everything from rent to food to clothing to entertainment to education to, telecommunications, etc. We can think about firms buying stuff in order to make more goods and services. So building factories, buying machines, buying trucks, buying computers that they're going to use to make more goods and services. That's what we call investment. And then government spending. So government spending in the United States is a little bit complicated because it has sort of three levels. It has the federal government, the state government, and the local government. But they buy goods and services. They also do investment, right? And so depending on sort of how the national accounts are organized, we might have government spending broken up into consumption of goods and services and investment, or we might have government investment put into just total investment. That would be things like roads and utilities that the government is building. Then we have sales to people in other countries. That's exports, so things we produce in our country, we'll say it's the United States, and sell to France or Japan or China or India. And then, because some of our consumption spending, investment spending, and government spending was spent on imports, things that were made in other countries and not in the United States, we have to subtract that out. So that's X minus M. X is for exports, M is for imports. Now, what about this II here, this red II? Well, that's changes in inventories. And usually in most textbooks, they note this, right? We call it inventory investment, but it just falls under regular investment. They have it broken out in this book. Inventory investment means all the things that we produced, but we haven't sold yet. So, we built a bunch of F-150s, but we haven't sold them yet. They're going to be sold in the next period, and so we have to include that. Because here in this equation, on the left side is everything we produce in the economy, right? And here on the right side is everything we buy. And so this is really an equilibrium condition that's saying everything we produce has to be equal to everything we buy. And that's why we have to subtract out those imports, right? Because we did not produce them, but we did buy them. All right. So we will continue this discussion in the next chapter. We'll continue looking at GDP. We'll look at the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. We'll look at GDP per capita, what that means, what it doesn't mean. as we continue chapter 3.